Stray dog blocks road in the rain. When they see why, they're in tears. What's the story behind this dog? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The rain poured in thick sheets, hammering the asphalt and creating shallow rivers along the edges of the road. Wind howled through the trees that lined the street, bending branches under its force, while headlights from passing cars pierced the gray veil of the downpour. It was one of those nights where people kept their heads down, gripping steering wheels tightly, desperate to get home. But on this narrow road, a stretch that passed through an old, neglected part of town, a figure stood motionless in the middle of the street. It was a dog. The animal's fur was soaked through, clinging to its lean frame. Its ears flattened against its head, and its amber eyes gleamed under the glare of headlights. In its mouth, it held something, a piece of paper or a photograph, muddied and damp but clenched tightly, as though it carried a message only it understood. Cars swerved to avoid the dog. Tires screeched as vehicles slid slightly on the wet pavement before regaining control and speeding past. Drivers cursed under their breath, shaking their heads and muttering about another stray. None of them stopped. But the dog didn't move. It stood firm, centered on the road like an unyielding statue, refusing to budge despite the rush of vehicles around it. The rain drenched it, water dripping from its nose and paws, yet its gaze remained steady and resolute, scanning the passing traffic as though searching for someone. Sarah was late. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a simple commute into a nightmare. She gripped the steering wheel, squinting against the wipers that could barely keep up with the deluge. Her small car skidded slightly around the bends in the road, and she cursed under her breath. "I shouldn't have taken this shortcut," she muttered. Sarah hated this part of town. The streetlights were dim, the buildings old and crumbling. The road itself was riddled with potholes, and with the rain pooling into them, each bump felt like a crater. But it was faster on any normal day, at least. As she rounded a curve, her headlights fell on something unusual in the distance. At first, it looked like a shadow barely distinguishable from the storm. But as she got closer, her stomach dropped. There, in the middle of the road, was a dog. Sarah tapped the brakes, her car sliding slightly before coming to a stop about 20 feet from the animal. Through the windshield, she could see it clearly now, a scruffy golden-brown dog, soaked and shivering, staring directly at her car. Its gaze was unnerving. "What are you doing there?" Sarah muttered, as if the dog could hear her. She flashed her lights, hoping it would scare the dog off the road. It didn't move. Sarah honked her horn, a short, sharp blast that echoed through the rain-soaked street. The dog flinched slightly, its ears twitching, but it didn't budge. For a long moment, Sarah sat in her car, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof the only sound. Every instinct told her to keep driving, to swerve around the dog and continue on her way. She was late, after all, and who knew what a stray dog in the middle of the road might do? But something about the way the dog looked at her made her hesitate. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't afraid. Its amber eyes seemed to plead with her, to beg her to understand something she couldn't yet see. And then she noticed the photograph. It was small, damp, and clutched tightly between the dog's teeth. The edges were muddy, and the image on it was hard to make out through the rain. But it was there, some kind of picture. Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. With a resigned sigh, she turned on her hazard lights, grabbed an umbrella from the passenger seat, and opened her door. The rain hit her like a wall, soaking her shoes in seconds as she stepped onto the flooded pavement. Okay, she muttered, holding the umbrella above her head. "Let's see what's going on with you." The dog didn't move as she approached. Its gaze stayed locked on her, unblinking, as though it had been waiting for her specifically. When she was just a few feet away, Sarah crouched slightly, trying to appear non-threatening. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, her voice nearly drowned by the sound of the rain. "What are you doing out here?" The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, a single, hopeful motion, as if acknowledging her kindness. Up close, Sarah could see how thin it was. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its wet fur, and its paws were caked with mud. Despite the rain, it smelled faintly of earth and dampness, like it had been outside for far too long. She gestured toward the photograph still in the dog's mouth. "What have you got there?" The dog tilted its head slightly, and then to Sarah's amazement, it stepped closer. Carefully, as though sensing her gentle intentions, it released the photograph, letting it fall into her waiting hand. Sarah stared at the damp image. It was a picture of two children, a young boy and girl, no older than 10, their faces beaming with bright, joyful smiles. The photo was faded, the edges torn, but the expressions on their faces were unmistakably happy. Sarah frowned. "Who are they?" The dog barked softly, just once, and then turned, trotting a few steps away before stopping to look back at her. Sarah blinked. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was leading her. "You want me to follow you?" she asked, half laughing at the absurdity of it all. The dog barked again, more insistent this time, before turning and starting toward the edge of the road. Sarah glanced back at her car, its hazard light still blinking. The thought of leaving it there in the storm made her hesitate, but something about the dog's behavior gnawed at her. It wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It had a purpose. And so, after another moment's hesitation, she followed. Sarah trudged through the rain, her shoes squelching with every step as she hurried after the dog. It stayed just ahead of her, leading her off the road and onto a narrow, muddy path that cut through an overgrown field. The rain hadn't let up, and her umbrella offered little protection against the wind. "Where are we going?" she called out, her voice carried away by the storm. The dog didn't answer, of course. It simply pressed on, its determination unwavering despite the downpour. The field seemed endless, the mud sucking at Sarah's feet as she struggled to keep up. Twice, she nearly lost sight of the dog in the rain, but it always reappeared, its amber eyes glowing faintly as it turned back to make sure she was still following. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dog stopped. Sarah slowed to a halt, gasping for breath as she wiped rain from her face. She looked around, trying to make sense of where they were. The field ended here, giving way to a small cluster of trees. Beneath the branches, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a small wooden structure. Sarah squinted. It looked like a shack or maybe an old storage shed, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly as the wind pushed against it. The dog barked once, its tail wagging faintly as it trotted toward the shack. It stopped at the entrance, looking back at Sarah expectantly. "You've got to be kidding me," Sarah muttered, but she stepped forward anyway. As she neared the shack, her heart began to race. The air here felt heavy, as though the rain itself carried some unspoken weight. She hesitated at the doorway, peering inside. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. The small space was damp and smelled of mildew, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed inside. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something in the far corner, a pile of blankets, tattered and dirty, huddled beneath a makeshift wooden beam. And then she heard it. A faint sound, soft, broken, and unmistakably human. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, and moved closer to the pile of blankets. Slowly, she crouched down and pulled one of them back. Her heart nearly stopped. There, curled up in the corner, were two small children, a boy and a girl, no older than the ones in the photograph. Their faces were pale, their clothes soaked and dirty, and they clung to each other as though trying to stay warm. Sarah's voice trembled. "Oh my God." The dog barked softly behind her, its tail wagging as though to say, "This is why I brought you." For a moment, Sarah froze, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. The two children clung to each other in the corner of the shack, their small bodies curled up beneath the thin, damp blankets. They looked so fragile, so still, as though they had been huddling there for days. The boy's eyes fluttered open first. They were large and dark, staring up at her with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The girl stirred moments later, her face pale, beneath a curtain of tangled hair. Sarah's voice came out in a shaky whisper. Hey, it's okay. You're safe now." The children didn't respond. The girl flinched slightly as Sarah moved closer, her fingers gripping the boy's arm as though afraid he might vanish. Sarah's heart broke at the sight. What had happened to them? How long had they been out here, hiding from the world? The dog stood quietly at the entrance, watching the scene unfold with its steady amber eyes. It didn't bark or move, as though its job was already done. Sarah turned back to the children, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm going to help you, okay? I won't hurt you. My name is Sarah." The boy opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lips were dry and cracked, and when Sarah placed her hand gently on his forehead, she could feel how feverish he was. "You're burning up," she murmured, her chest tightening. "We need to get you out of here." The girl's voice came out as a whisper, soft and almost inaudible, Don't leave us. Sarah's throat tightened. I'm not going to leave you. I promise. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound of it mixing with the faint rustling of leaves around the shack. Sarah glanced at the dog, who was still standing guard by the doorway, as though waiting for her to take action. Okay, she said, exhaling sharply. Let's get you someplace warm. It took every ounce of strength Sarah had to lift the children into her arms. They were light, far too light for their age, and as she carried them one by one back to her car, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what they must have endured. The dog followed close behind, its fur still soaked and matted from the rain. It stayed near Sarah's side, as though guiding her through the storm, its presence steady and reassuring. When Sarah finally reached her car, she opened the back door and gently laid the children across the seats, wrapping them in her coat to keep them warm. The boy shivered slightly, his small hands clutching the fabric, while the girl's breathing remained slow and shallow. Sarah turned back to the dog, who stood a few feet away, watching her with that same unwavering gaze. Are you coming? She asked softly, gesturing to the car. The dog hesitated for a moment before climbing into the front passenger seat, settling down with a quiet sigh. Sarah climbed behind the wheel, her hands trembling as she started the engine. Hang on, kids. We're going to get you help. The drive back to town was slow and nerve-wracking. The rain hadn't let up and visibility was still terrible, but Sarah didn't care. She kept glancing back at the children through the rearview mirror, her heart pounding in her chest every time one of them stirred or coughed. The dog sat silently beside her, its head resting on the edge of the seat. Every so often, it would turn to look at the children, its expression calm but alert, as though making sure they were still okay. Sarah couldn't stop herself from talking to it. You're incredible, you know that? You saved their lives. The dog didn't respond, of course, but something in its quiet presence told her it understood. When Sarah pulled up to the nearest hospital, she barely had time to park before nurses and staff rushed out to meet her. They took one look at the children and sprang into action, carrying them inside as Sarah hurried behind them. They were out in the rain, she explained breathlessly, her clothes still dripping wet. I don't know how long they've been there. They're cold, and I think the boy has a fever. The nurses nodded, asking no further questions as they led the children into one of the treatment rooms. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway for a moment, her mind spinning. Are you their guardian? A nurse asked gently, breaking her thoughts. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. I found them. Or, well, he found them. She gestured toward the dog, who sat patiently by the hospital entrance, its fur leaving wet puddles on the floor. The nurse frowned slightly. The dog? Sarah nodded, running a hand through her soaked hair. It led me to them. It was blocking the road, and I followed it to where the kids were hiding. If it hadn't been for that dog. Her voice trailed off, but the nurse smiled faintly, as though she understood. It sounds like a guardian angel to me. Sarah looked at the dog, who was still watching her, its amber eyes steady and calm. Yes, she murmured. Something like that. Hours passed before Sarah finally got an update on the children. They're stable, one of the doctors told her. Dehydrated, malnourished, and the boy has a mild fever, but they're going to be okay. Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her like a wave. Thank God. The doctor nodded. Do you know anything about them? Who they are or where they came from? Sarah shook her head. I found this. She handed him the photograph the dog had given her. That's all I know. I think it's them, though. The doctor studied the photo for a moment before nodding. We'll contact the authorities. If anyone's looking for them, they'll know soon. Sarah glanced back at the entrance, where the dog still sat patiently, its tail wagging faintly. What about him? She asked quietly. The doctor smiled. It sounds like he's earned a place by their side, hasn't he? Sarah grinned, wiping a tear from her cheek. Yeah, I'd say so. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to clear. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden glow over the hospital parking lot. Sarah stood by her car, watching as the children, now cleaned up and wrapped in warm blankets, sat with the dog just outside the entrance. The boy smiled faintly as he reached out to scratch behind the dog's ears, while the girl rested her head against its side, her small fingers clutching its fur. Sarah walked over, crouching beside them. You're safe now, she said softly. They're going to take care of you. The boy looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. Sarah smiled, her throat tight. Don't thank me. Thank him. She nodded toward the dog, who wagged its tail and gave a soft bark as if to say, I was just doing my job. The girl looked up, her voice small but steady. He's our hero. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling. Yeah, he really is. The hospital staff worked swiftly to ensure the children were cared for properly. The small boy, whose fever had started to break, lay curled up under a blanket in one of the quieter wards, his frail body finally warm for the first time in days. The girl, slightly more alert, sat beside him, watching the dog with wide, curious eyes as it rested on the floor nearby. Sarah stood outside the doorway, leaning against the wall as the events of the night finally caught up with her. Her clothes were dry now, but she still felt the damp chill in her bones, the memory of trudging through the rain vivid in her mind. She watched through the glass window, heart full of questions she couldn't answer. Who were these children? Why had they been hiding in that shack? And what connection did this loyal, soaked dog have to them? The photograph still lingered in her thoughts, the image of two smiling faces, so full of life, held tightly by the dog as though it carried a sacred message. Sarah heard soft footsteps behind her. A nurse approached with a kind smile, a clipboard in hand. The kids are resting, the nurse said softly. We've contacted social services. They're going to look into where the children came from and if they have any family nearby. Sarah nodded slowly. Do they know anything yet? The nurse sighed, glancing back toward the room. Not much. The girl hasn't said much at all, just bits and pieces. She told us they'd been living in that shack for a few days, but she didn't explain why. The boy, he's still too weak to talk much, but he'll be okay. Sarah glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved from its spot on the floor. Its head rested on its paws, amber eyes still watchful, still protective. And him, she asked, gesturing toward the dog. The nurse smiled faintly. The kids call him Max. That's all we've gotten so far. He's been at their side the whole time. Wherever those kids came from, this dog has been looking after them. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Max, she murmured, testing the name on her lips. It suited him, strong, simple, loyal. The nurse placed a hand on her arm. You did a good thing bringing them here, Sarah. Those kids wouldn't have survived much longer out in the cold. Sarah swallowed hard. It wasn't me, she said quietly. It was him. They both looked back at Max. His ears perked up slightly as though he could hear their conversation, and his tail gave the faintest thump against the floor. Over the next few days, the story of the children and the dog who saved them began to spread. The hospital staff talked about it in hushed voices, their faces filled with wonder and disbelief. Reporters caught wind of the story too, and within hours, it was being shared online and on local news stations. Loyal dog saves 2 abandoned children from certain death. The headlines spread like wildfire, accompanied by the photo Sarah had taken. 2 children, now safe, sitting beside a golden brown dog whose amber eyes seemed to hold endless secrets. The image touched hearts everywhere. People shared their thoughts, their tears, and their admiration for Max, the hero who had stood in the pouring rain, refusing to move until help arrived. Sarah watched it all unfold from a distance, unsure how to process it. She visited the children each day, checking in on them and bringing small comforts, stuffed animals, warm socks, and books. She couldn't explain why she felt so connected to them, but something inside her told her she couldn't just walk away. Max remained a constant presence at the hospital. The staff allowed him to stay, recognizing his importance to the children's recovery. He slept beside their beds at night, his breathing steady and reassuring, and during the day he followed them quietly, as though he had taken it upon himself to be their protector. One morning, as Sarah sat with the children in their room, the girl finally spoke. Max found us, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up, surprised. He found you. The girl nodded, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. We got lost. We were trying to find our way back home, but it started raining. Max found us in the field and stayed with us. Sarah's heart tightened. How long were you out there? The girl looked down, her voice trembling. I don't know. A long time. Sarah glanced at the boy, who was still sleeping soundly beside her. She could only imagine how terrified they must have been, cold, hungry, and alone in the storm, with no one to help them. And yet, somehow, Max had appeared out of nowhere, as though guided by some unseen force. He kept us warm, the girl added, her eyes glancing toward Max, who was curled up at the foot of the bed. He wouldn't leave us. Sarah swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're safe now," she said softly. "You're not alone anymore." The girl looked up at her, her dark eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you." Sarah shook her head, her gaze shifting to Max. "Don't thank me," she whispered. "Thank him." Days turned into a week. The children began to recover, their strength returning little by little. The boy, whose fever had finally broken, started to smile again, his laughter filling the hospital room like a warm breeze. The girl, once so quiet and withdrawn, began to talk more, telling Sarah stories about their lives before they'd gotten lost. Stories of a small house, a garden, and parents who loved them dearly. Social services worked tirelessly to find the children's family, and one afternoon, Sarah received the news she had been waiting for. "We found their parents," a social worker told her, smiling warmly. "They've been searching for them for days. They're on their way here now." Sarah's heart swelled with relief. "That's amazing." The social worker nodded. "The kids are going to be okay, and they'll never forget what you and that dog did for them." Sarah glanced back at Max, who was curled up beside the boy's bed, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "He's the real hero here," she said with a smile. When the children's parents arrived later that day, the reunion was nothing short of emotional. Tears were shed, hugs were exchanged, and the boy and girl clung to their mother and father as though afraid to let go. Max watched from a distance, his head tilted slightly, as though trying to understand the scene unfolding before him. Sarah knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought them home." Max leaned into her touch, his amber eyes soft and knowing. The parents approached Sarah moments later, their faces still wet with tears. "Thank you," the mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "We don't even know how to begin thanking you." Sarah shook her head. "Don't thank me. It was him." She gestured to Max, who wagged his tail happily. The father knelt down, reaching out to pet the dog. "You saved our children's lives," he said softly. "We owe you everything." Max barked quietly as though to say, "I was just doing what I had to do." As the parents knelt beside Max, petting the dog who had saved their children's lives, the air in the room was heavy with gratitude. The mother wiped tears from her cheeks, her voice trembling as she spoke. "He stayed with them, didn't he?" she whispered, her gaze shifting between Max and her children. "Out there in the cold and rain, he didn't leave them." Sarah nodded, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "Not for a second. He led me to them, stood in the middle of the road, refusing to move until someone stopped." The father looked at Max with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It's like he knew they needed help. The mother reached out and cupped Max's face in her hands, her fingers trembling as she ran them over his damp fur. "You saved my babies," she said softly, her voice breaking. "You're our angel." Max tilted his head slightly, his amber eyes calm and knowing. He wagged his tail faintly as though to say, "It's okay. They're safe now." Sarah felt her chest tighten at the scene. She had always been a practical person, someone who believed in actions rather than miracles. But seeing the connection between this family and the loyal, rain-soaked dog, she couldn't help but wonder if some unseen force had guided Max to the children that night. "Do you know where he came from?" the father asked suddenly, turning to Sarah. She shook her head. "No. He just appeared on the road, holding that photograph." The mother frowned, glancing at the picture still clutched in Sarah's hand. "That's ours," she said softly. "That was taken last year. I thought we'd lost it." Sarah looked down at the photo. The edges were muddy and torn, but the smiles of the children in the picture were unmistakable. "He was carrying it when I found him," she said. "It was like he was trying to show me something, to lead me to them." The father let out a long breath, his expression distant as though trying to piece everything together. "We had a dog like him once," he said quietly. "A stray that showed up near our house a few months ago. The kids named him Max, but he didn't stick around for long. One day, he just disappeared. I thought he'd moved on." His voice trailed off, and he looked back at Max, who lay calmly on the hospital floor, watching the family with steady, attentive eyes. The mother's voice trembled. "It's him, isn't it?" The realization hung in the air like a physical weight. This wasn't just any dog. This was their dog, the one who had once wandered into their lives only to vanish again, as though waiting for the right moment to return. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as the pieces clicked into place. "He came back for them," she whispered. The boy stirred in his bed, his small voice breaking the silence. "Max. Max didn't leave us." The mother moved to her son's side, gently stroking his hair. "No, sweetheart. He didn't leave you." The boy turned his head slightly, his tired eyes finding Max across the room. "He kept us warm when it was cold. He brought us here." Max lifted his head, his ears perking up at the sound of his name. He barked softly, a gentle, reassuring sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "He saved them," she said, her voice thick. "He really saved them." As the days passed, the children's recovery continued, and the story of Max spread even further. Local newspapers ran headlines celebrating the hero dog who had braved the storm to save 2 lost children. Photos of Max, sitting proudly beside the smiling kids, appeared on news stations and social media, where people shared messages of admiration and gratitude for his loyalty. Messages poured in from strangers who had been touched by the story. People called Max a miracle, a guardian angel, a symbol of hope in a world that so often seemed cold and indifferent. Donations flooded the hospital in honor of the dog, many of them marked with notes saying, "For Max, the hero." Sarah visited the children often, bringing treats and toys to brighten their days. Max remained a fixture at their side, following them through the halls of the hospital like a shadow. Everywhere he went, people stopped to pet him, to thank him, to marvel at the quiet strength in his amber eyes. One afternoon, as Sarah sat with the family in the hospital garden, the mother turned to her with a smile. "We've decided to adopt him officially," she said, stroking Max's back as he lay beside her. "He's been a part of our family all along, and we didn't even realize it." Sarah grinned, tears pooling in her eyes. "That's amazing. He belongs with you." The boy, sitting cross-legged on a grass, leaned over and wrapped his arms around Max's neck. "He's our hero," he said softly. Max licked the boy's face, his tail wagging furiously, and for the first time, Sarah saw him truly relaxed, truly happy. He had done his job, and now he was home. The day the children were released from the hospital, a crowd gathered outside the entrance. Reporters, photographers, and well-wishers stood under the clearing sky, waiting to catch a glimpse of the little heroes and the dog who had saved them. Sarah stood near the back, watching with a mix of pride and awe as the family stepped out, hand in hand, with Max trotting happily at their side. The children waved shyly at the cameras, their faces bright and full of life, while Max wagged his tail, soaking up the attention with quiet dignity. A reporter knelt down, aiming a microphone toward the boy. "How do you feel about Max saving you?" she asked gently. The boy smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Max's ears. "He's my best friend," he said simply. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the parking lot. Sarah couldn't stop smiling as she watched the scene unfold, her heart full of gratitude for everything Max had done. As the family climbed into their car, ready to start their new chapter together, the mother turned to Sarah one last time. "Thank you for stopping that night," she said softly. "If you hadn't followed him." Sarah shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was him. Max was the real hero." The mother smiled, glancing down at the loyal dog who sat proudly at her feet. "Yes, he was." That night, as Sarah drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about Max. The image of him standing in the rain, refusing to move until someone noticed, would stay with her forever. It wasn't just loyalty that had driven him. It was love. Love for the children he had watched over, love for the family that had once been his, and love for a world that had so often overlooked him. Sarah parked her car in her driveway and sat there for a moment, staring up at the clear night sky. Somewhere out there, she thought, there were more stories like Max's waiting to be told. Stories of loyalty, of sacrifice, and of the incredible bond between humans and animals. As she climbed out of the car and stepped inside, she smiled to herself, whispering softly into the quiet, "Good boy, Max, good boy." The days that followed felt surreal for Sarah. The story of Max spread far beyond what anyone could have expected. National news stations picked it up, calling him the guardian angel dog. Videos of Max sitting proudly by the children went viral, with millions of people touched by his unwavering loyalty and bravery. People from around the world wrote heartfelt comments and messages. A true hero in every sense of the word. "We don't deserve dogs. This story restored my faith in humanity. Max had become a symbol of hope, proof that kindness and love could still exist in unexpected places. Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude every time she saw him, knowing she had played a small role in his journey. But in her heart, she knew this story wasn't about her. It was about Max and the silent, powerful way he had brought a family back together. One morning, about a week after the children were discharged, Sarah received a phone call she wasn't expecting. It was from the family. "Would you like to come visit?" the mother asked warmly. "The kids have been asking about you. And Max, well, he seems to be waiting for someone." Sarah smiled, feeling her heart skip a beat. "I'd love to." When she arrived at the family's modest home on the outskirts of town, she was greeted by the sound of laughter spilling out through the open windows. The house felt alive, full of warmth and joy, as though the storm that had once threatened to tear this family apart had finally passed. The mother opened the door, pulling Sarah into a tight hug. "We're so glad you came." Sarah stepped inside and was immediately greeted by Max, who barreled toward her with a joyful bark. His tail wagged furiously as he nuzzled against her hand, his golden brown fur now clean and soft. "Hey boy," Sarah said with a laugh, scratching behind his ears. "You look so much happier." The children appeared moments later, running toward her with wide smiles. The boy clung to her leg while the girl grabbed her hand, her eyes shining with excitement. "You came," the girl said happily. "We missed you." Sarah felt her chest swell with emotion as she knelt down to hug them both. "I missed you too." "Max missed you the most," the boy added, glancing back at the dog, who sat proudly beside them. Sarah smiled. "I think Max's heart is big enough to love all of us." The family invited Sarah to join them for lunch, and as they sat around the table, laughter filled the air. The children chattered excitedly about their plans, how they wanted to go back to school, play in the garden, and take Max for walks every day. "We owe everything to him," the father said suddenly, looking over at Max, who lay contentedly near the fireplace. "I don't know what we would have done if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone at the table understood. Max lifted his head, as if sensing he was being talked about. He gave a soft bark, earning a round of laughter from the family. The mother smiled, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "You're part of this family now," she said softly, "and you always will be." Sarah watched the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. It was such a simple moment, quiet and unremarkable, yet filled with so much love. She thought back to the night she had found Max, standing alone in the rain with nothing but a photograph in his mouth. She remembered how he had refused to move, how he had led her to that shack, and how he had stayed by the children's side through it all. "He knew what he was doing," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. The father looked up. "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled faintly. "That night, Max didn't just happen to be there. He was looking for someone to help. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he waited for me to find him. It's like he knew he had to save them." The family fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. The mother wiped a tear from her cheek. "Sometimes I think animals understand things we can't. They feel things we don't." Sarah nodded. Maybe he was always meant to be their guardian angel. That afternoon, Sarah joined the family outside in the garden. The sun was shining brightly, the air crisp and clear as though nature itself was celebrating the family's reunion. The children ran through the grass, their laughter ringing out like music, while Max trotted happily beside them, his tail wagging like a banner. Sarah stood back, watching the scene with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't explain what had drawn her to stop that night, to follow Max through the storm and trust that he was leading her somewhere important. But she knew now that it hadn't been an accident. As if sensing her thoughts, Max turned and looked at her, his amber eyes meeting hers across the garden. For a moment, they stared at each other, and Sarah felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. "Thank you," she whispered softly. Max barked once, then turned back to the children, as though to say, "You're welcome." The story of Max and the children remained a favorite in the community for years to come. People remembered it as a miracle, a story of love, loyalty, and the extraordinary bond between a dog and the family he saved. The children grew stronger with each passing day, their lives filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of a home that had once felt so far away. Max remained their constant companion, watching over them with the same unwavering devotion that had driven him to stand in the rain that fateful night. Sarah visited often, becoming a close friend of the family. Each time she saw Max, he would greet her with the same joyful bark and wagging tail, as though he remembered the role she had played in their story. Years later, when people asked Sarah about that night, she would always tell them the same thing. "It wasn't me," she would say with a smile. "It was Max. I just followed his lead." And every time, she would remember the image of him standing in the rain, so small and yet so full of purpose, holding a photograph in his mouth, refusing to give up until someone listened. Because sometimes, heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they come with wagging tails and amber eyes that see what others can't. As the sun set on that final memory, Sarah stood in the family's garden once more, watching Max as he lay peacefully beneath the old oak tree, the children playing happily nearby. The world felt right again, and in that quiet moment, she knew one thing for certain. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle.